Hey guys, I'm learning TFT. In this video, I'm going to VOD review one of my recent games playing Conquerors, but I'm going to take a playbook out of Sub-Zero Arc where I'm going to talk about the Augment data removal while I'm doing the VOD review. So this is mostly going to be focused on what the impact of the data removal is, but also touch on the kind of high level points of how to play tempo Conquerors. So Mortdog yesterday talked about removing augments from the endgame screen, and that would also result in removing the augment stats from all of the data sites. And I'm gonna go ahead and get started on this VOD. And by the way, I signed up for ASA's Coaching Plus program. So this was an in-house with ASA, Marcel, and a bunch of other participants of that program. So I'm gonna go ahead and play. And by the way, this is gonna be a Conquerors game. And one of the key aspects of playing Conquerors is you really wanna get a 2-star Darius or Draven early and tempo it hard because it's a win. Basically, it's like Sugarcraft where you get more stacks the more takedowns you get, and that kind of snowballs over time. It's also similar to Noxus from 3 sets ago, I believe. Not set 9. And Darius and Draven were also Noxus, I believe, from that set. And the basic idea is you want to just keep playing from ahead, get more stacks, which is like Sugarcraft. You can see the 0 out of 10 here. Every time you get a takedown, you get a stack. And then once you hit the breakpoints, you cash them out. So you usually want to push levels so you can stay ahead of tempo. I've tried experimenting with reroll and it didn't quite work. And here, because we have extra item components, I can get and I already have a 2-star Darius, I can get a full 3 item carry with Darius, Unleash the Beast with like a BT Hodge, and maybe with the vest I can make a Titans later. And with Conquerors, you can also, because you have Draven as a pit fighter, you have a lot of melee units that could then transfer the Unleash the Beast to later. Like Vi is a 4 cost, that's a pit fighter, and then Savika is a 5 cost. So you can really tempo really well with Unleash the Beast and a bunch of melee items into the late game. So that's kind of my overall game plan. So with that said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the augment removals. And one thing that I haven't really seen people talk about after Mortdog's announcement is the impact that data has across regions. And I have one hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis. I don't know how much it's true, but for Mortdog to call this out, I suspect, and by the way, I probably should have leveled here, but I got lucky. But I was also thinking I would win anyway with a fully itemized Darius too. But one thing that people didn't really talk about in reaction to Mortdog's post is how different regions have access to significantly more data. Specifically, I believe China and Vietnam likely have, I don't know how much more data, but significantly more data than NA or Europe. And that could have resulted in a very large advantage and progression in their meta that could occur faster than it would in NA, for example. Now, I don't want to take away from how well APAC did in Worlds Set 13, but their absolute dominance, I suspect part of that could likely be because they had a data set advantage. And this is just as true in like the world of AI today. It's, yes, anybody can create with open source, like stronger AI and learning tools, but a big part of, for example, ChatGPT's success is they took out a ton of funding to get access to just tons and tons of data. And that over time, if you have a much larger base like Vietnam does or China, becomes arguably a huge advantage for that region if it has more access to data. So if this hypothesis might be true, then we might be seeing in set 13 a decrease in the success of the APAC region, at least relative to the other regions out there. Again, this is just a hypothesis, mainly because Mortdog is pointing to this as a possible or competitive integrity thing. So we'll see how much of that is true. Um, Next, I want to talk about kind of stats and its impact on how we play. I have some notes on the side, so I'm just kind of referencing it. But one thing that Demacian Raptor encouraged in our coaching sessions was he noticed that I would spend too much time looking up stats, augment stats, and specifically tailor to specific situations as opposed to just the aggregate stats, like what's best for a certain comp. And that would impact how much time I would have left to make decisions on augment selection rounds. For example, on 4-2, I'd be really slow to do a roll down and I'd be taking like a ton of damage on 4-2 if I went fast 8. And so he suggested that I just don't play with any stats for 1 or 2 days. And while that resulted in me initially losing a lot more than I might, in the mid to longer term, it actually made me think a lot more critically about the decisions that I was making. So I could definitely see the argument for that. I wanted to read a quote by Nicholas Carr from his book, The Shallows. He's talking about, this book is very interesting about how the internet has, I'll just read this quote, "When we go online, we enter an environment that promotes cursory reading, hurried and distracted thinking, and superficial learning. It's possible to think deeply while surfing the net, just as it's possible to think shallowly while reading a book. But that's not the type of thinking that technology encourages and rewards." And I believe that you can apply this idea to stats, where when you can just memorize stats or just reference stats, it allows you to be lazy and removes the potential for critical thinking. And while I believe that removing stats doesn't necessarily solve this problem, because if people are lazy and just want to look for a simple solution, they can find that by just looking at tier lists that are probably going to come up by influencers. And I might create tier lists too, but the idea is that hopefully you start to think more critically instead of just taking what's statistically good. And here, by the way, I want to keep pushing my tempo because I'm full streaking with Conqueror. And so the idea, going back to kind of the first augments here, instead of thinking about this augment selection from the standpoint of like, oh, which one's performing best statistically, you want to consider context of your current game plan, which is that I am playing for Conqueror right now. I am full streaking, and I want to press my advantage to get more stacks and preserve streak to get more gold. So I want an augment that's very strong right now, and that can continue to push my advantage. Now, the stats are not going to take that fully into account, and does not account for kind of your current game plan and game state. And so that's kind of an example of what relying on stats kind of becomes a crutch to prevent you from being able to make critical thinking decisions like that. And it's even more true for newer players who arguably might benefit from that more. Next, I have a quote on focusing by Daniel Kahneman from his book Thinking Fast and Slow. He said, quote, "We pay more attention to the content of messages than to information about their reliability, and as a result end up with a view of the world around us that is simpler and more coherent than the data justify." And so this quote is arguing that, so from a augment statistics standpoint, you could say that a small sample size of data is unreliable and people can draw unfair conclusions from that. And that's like a simple example. But there are situations where if everyone looks at the data and thinks that something's better, they can then jump onto that bandwagon, and that could then influence the data set even more. And so then the data becomes part of this recursive loop that affects the reliability of that data that may not have been the case in a vacuum where nobody had access to the data. And so part of this is just to say that when we think about just relying completely on data, we oftentimes forget that there can be issues in that data set's reliability, especially early on in a set where people have, like, let's say you the meta is a certain way at the start of a patch and then it evolves very quickly in the middle of the patch. Well, people's assumptions about how the meta worked at the start of the patch may not apply to how it might work in the middle of the patch. Let's say the meta goes from a very front to back scaling meta to, like, let's say Kassadin reroll from last patch or this patch becoming very dominant. And therefore the augments that are good would shift. But if nobody knew that Kassadin reroll is good, then you wouldn't be taking a lot of the melee augment stats. And if you don't know how to play the melee units the right way, you don't even know that Kassadin's good, let's say, and let's say everyone was playing Gwen and Fiora, then that would mess up the data. And so reliability of the data is extremely important. And when you move the stats, it forces you to think more creatively and critically about that. Next quote I have is from Gary Kasparov from his book, How Life Imitates Chess. He said, quote, "Long before a player becomes a master, he realizes that rote memorization, however prodigious, I don't know if I pronounced that right, is useless without understanding. At some point, he'll reach the end of his memory's rope and be without a pre-made fix in a position he doesn't really understand." So there's plenty of points where I have augments that are statistically good, and then it might even be broken in the stats, like averages under a 4.0. And then I play the game and I don't understand how that augment really works. I don't understand the conditions with which it's good. And I might end up getting an 8th as a result of that. And that's what Kasparov's saying here, is that a chess player can memorize all of the book openings and play the opening perfectly. But if you don't know why you made certain decisions and what the strengths and weaknesses are of the initial memorization that you applied, then you can end up in situations where you aren't able to take advantage of what the strengths of that situation were supposed to be. And by the way here, this support item is really good because I'm playing towards multiple melee units, and getting this vow is extremely good. And I high rolled an early Savika. And so here you could see I'm only lost one round up until this point, getting a ton of conqueror stacks. And I have a Vi as well. So I basically am playing towards 3 melee carries. So this is Kasparov's quote also aligns with what Demacian Raptor was saying, that when you take off that reliance on memorization and stats, it forces you to really think more critically and creatively about the decisions that you're making. And one of the side products of removing stats will be that it will give an advantage to players who can socialize more, and that will make study groups more advantageous, which is another reason that maybe this change could actually benefit NA more than, for example, China, who has less of a culture of study groups than NA does, though it seems like that's starting to shift on their side. Robert Wright from his book Non-Zero says, "Data are often of little or no cost and great benefit. Swapping them is one of the oldest forms of non-zero sum interaction. People by their nature come together to constitute a social information processing system and thus reap positive sums." So I've talked about this a little bit in a previous video about the evolution of cooperation and how even in a competitive environment, evolution has shown that working together and cooperating is actually positive sum and beneficial to individual players within a competitive environment. And so this will definitely be true in a system where data is less accessible and the exchanging of information and experience becomes more valuable. So being able to engage in Reddit, in Twitter, in Discord study groups, watching more YouTube videos, and I would love for people to engage with these videos in the comments to serve as like maybe even a mini study group as well, becomes extremely valuable. Another quote I have is by E.O. Wilson in his book Consilience. He said, quote, "We are drowning in information while starving for wisdom. The world will be run by synthesizers, people able to put together the right information at the right time, thinking critically about it, and make important choices wisely. So this is very true for the world and very true for TFT, where there oftentimes can be a seemingly infinite amount of information, and we don't know what to do with that information. Oftentimes we misinterpret the information, we over rely on the information and data, and aren't able to properly draw the right conclusions about what is signal and what is noise, and how to properly assess that information to make the best decisions possible. And so by removing augment stats, I would potentially argue that we should hopefully be able to create more wisdom and more critical thinking as a result of that. So, by the way, in this game, I'm trying to look for 6 conqueror, ideally by finding a Mordekaiser. And although I think I accidentally sold the Darius 2 earlier, so I should have used an item remover on that instead. But I got a ton of traits active here, and my board's looking pretty good. So to kind of summarize the pros and cons of this data removal situation, and you can see here that I have 3 full melee carries, and I can get a 4th one here with Rumble. And Rumble has anti-heal, so I don't actually need that, but it would be ideal if I could get some form of shred, since I don't have any and all my melee units are AD. So to summarize, the pros I see of stat removal is that there's 1, less regional discrepancy in data access. 2, it should hopefully promote more critical thinking and benefit those who are theory crafting more, especially if and I think this point is probably questionable, that if the search space in TFT and decision making is wide enough in the kind of number of possible game states, then experience in the form of a single player or even like a study group will not be large enough to override the advantage of someone that is really critically thinking and dynamically making decisions and theory crafting and preparing ahead of time, not necessarily staring and memorizing at stats, but looking at the individual units. And by the way, I get a conqueror emblem here, which allows me to get 6 conqueror without the Darius, assuming I can find the Mordekaiser. But being able to theory craft, a lot of this depends on if Riot makes TFT search space large enough, then even if someone plays 1,000 games, they won't be able to get a large enough sample size from their own experience to draw adequate conclusions about what's specifically right in what certain situation. And therefore, being able to think critically has an advantage over amount of time played. So that hypothesis is still questionable depending on, and one of the good things is that Anomalies has 60 permutations, and so it really would take a lot of time for an individual player to play a whole set. Like I played a whole set and didn't get access to certain augments like more than 1 or 2 times, which is not enough to draw like conclusions about that data set or the strength of that augment. And 3, the pro of removing the augments is it results in more socializing, which I think overall is just good for the health of the game. To me, part of what's so fun and engaging and interesting about TFT is the community. It's an extremely positive community, one that is very kind of positive sum and interesting to engage with. I find that TFT players have a very interesting psyche and approach to learning and a beginner's mindset. At least the top players really embody that. And I think promoting socialization in the community is just overall good for the health of the game. Some of the cons that I see for this decision is that 1, it can create really poor experiences if there are certain augments that are bugged, like for example, Wukong hero augment in one of the early on was like averaging a 6.0 and extremely bugged. And so that Mortdog did say that they would be more proactive about either like removing augments hopefully or communicating to the community that certain augments are buggy and you shouldn't play them. but that's definitely one significant downside. If you're just clicking something and it's just not, it's like almost like you don't have an augment and you're down an augment, that really sucks. By the way, this 6 conqueror board really just steamrolled at the end. 6 conqueror, 4 pit fighter. And if you can tempo conquerors to the end game, just keep pushing levels, keep adding in more traits, keep getting these conqueror loot stacks. Like, this is one of the easiest games to play if you can just ride that tempo advantage. I suspect this is going to be one of the ways that if you could just ride ahead of tempo, the wave, all the way to the end game, this will be one of the strongest ways to play the game in set 13. So cons number 2, it may give an advantage to players with more time and more social access. Though again, that goes back to how many possible game states there are, and can one person or a few people in a study group reasonably explore the search space well enough to be able to draw reasonable conclusions, which to me is not really clear which way it leans. And then 3, I could see this augment stats removal lead to basically, it's the idea that it's not the tools that are the problem, it's not the stats that are the problem, but it's people's psychology that is the problem. It's like gun control. It's like, okay, we can remove guns, but like that's not the real problem. If we remove guns, like people will still find ways to inflict violence. Like the fundamental issue from where I see it is mental health. Like if we didn't just throw people in prison and like force them to figure things out themselves, but if we had universal healthcare in the form of psychologists, therapists for everybody who have challenges processing their emotions and anger and don't have ways of healthily discharging it, then even if guns existed, people wouldn't feel the need to use them. And so I think the same idea applies here, where if people are lazy and don't want to think critically, removing the stats isn't going to solve that problem. People are just going to find an alternate substitute solution to be able to be lazy, which might be the way that they enjoy playing the game. And so people will just shift their attention from stats to tier lists that like Robin Songs or TFT Academy puts out, for example. So that's kind of what I see as the pros and cons of this stats removal. Overall, I'm cautiously optimistic about how it might positively impact the game. I particularly look forward to seeing more socialization, and I want to engage more with socialization of the game. I've found that when I have looked at stats less, at least during a game, it allowed me to think a lot more critically and make more creative decisions in the game. But I also suspect I will be doing a lot more out of game analysis, manually like collecting my own augment data across my games, maybe looking at streams and collecting manual data there. Even though the sample size is small, hopefully that can at least give me indicators of like really broken stuff, outliers in the positive or negative direction. But overall, I think it's a plus, cautiously optimistic about it, but I can definitely see there being downsides. And so, I'm kind of like in the middle on the fence right now, and we'll see how it plays out. I would love to hear your thoughts about this augment data removal in the comments, specifically bouncing ideas around some of the points that I made. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and I'll see you in the next one.